Thank you all for joining us at today's Lunch and Learn on the role of NIH in bioinnovation and the availability and affordability of new medicines. My name is Dan Swiner. I'm the Hybrid JD Program Coordinator, and I'm happy to see events like these popping up on our calendars where different groups of our students have the opportunity to connect and discover new passions and new areas of law, intellectual property, and otherwise. I see these events having two really strong values at UNH Law. One being that kind of cross communication between folks that are all across the United States in the hybrid program, as well as our residential students here in Concord and anybody else who's connected to the UNH community. They also allow us to spend some time in an area where you're not necessarily being graded, and you can use your passion to really move the conversation forward. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today live. And for anybody who's watching this recording later, appreciate you finding the time. At this moment, I would like to turn it over to Professor Lucy Hodder, who can introduce our guests.
Thank you so much, Dan, and welcome to everybody. We have a wonderful cross-section of people from across our UNH campuses, our hybrid law and our residential law students, our Manchester, our Durham campuses, and then beyond into the community of people who really want to talk about what's going on in bioinnovation. You know, we heard today vaccines might be available. We also heard today other therapeutics might be available for COVID-19. So this subject is absolutely current, and we are sure to get a lot of questions. Just a little housekeeping. We had a slide which told you what to do. Keep yourself on mute, but please join in with camera and unmute yourself when you have a question during the Q&A, which there will be, and feel free to use the chat box to make sure your questions are lodged. We're going to have more discussion after if we don't have enough time, where we're going to continue this conversation for further inquiry. So please use that chat function. I'm Lucy Hodder. I'm the Director of Health Law and Policy, and I'm also hugely invested in our bioinnovation program at University of New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce School of Law. We started this program with a cross-section of our science, IP, and healthcare professors who really wanted to make sure we brought to this law school a strategic way of thinking for our students, and a multidisciplinary way of thinking where we could talk about innovations from bench to bedside. And we talk about IP strategies, about tech transfer, about contracting rights, about commercialization, about FDA regulation, about human subject testing, about fraud and abuse limitations on business planning and collaboration with physicians and providers, about coverage, coding, and payment, all the way into the delivery system. So we are really excited to have, as part of our bioinnovation series, our two speakers here today. Our bioinnovation program really relies on the expertise of our faculty and other guests, and Bill Murphy in antitrust, and John Orcott in IP, and Stan Kowalski, who's joining us today, who has a breadth of knowledge around IP and international vaccine development, and Ryan Vaca as well. So we couldn't be more thrilled that you all are joining us today. I want to turn it over to Bruce Leicher, who is now the Adjunct Professor running our bioinnovation program. He brings years of experience in life sciences, law, and biosimilars in particular, and is teaching our class and is moderating our program today. So Bruce, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for all the ways we make bioinnovation available to our students now and in the future when we bring it online with our hybrids in year to come. So Bruce, take it away.
Well, thank you, Lucy, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. You know, I just would encourage anyone who's interested in immersing themselves in sort of the business of biotechnology and bioinnovation law to think about taking the class as your schedule permits. But you know, I'm really pleased to be here today to introduce two really interesting researchers that I've worked with for years. Dr. Ledley and Dr. Cleary. They both come to us from the Center for the Integration of Science and Industry, a center that they were both instrumental in founding at Bentley University, where they focus on really cutting edge health policy issues, and they focus on how does science translate itself into real world medicine and application in medicine. And they recently published a fascinating paper that you can look in the chat section for the link, which they're going to speak to on the degree to which NIH funding has played just a remarkable role in creating the ecosystem that our biotech industry lives from. And with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Cleary and Dr. Ledley, and let them tell you about the research.
Great, thank you, Bruce and Lucy. And let me just introduce this with really very few words about our approach at the Center for Integration of Science and Industry. Our approach is really informed by experience in both basic research and also in industry and early stage biotechnology, and a belief that the effective translation of scientific discoveries for public value requires effective synergies between business and science, between the capital and between the body of basic research. And this is, we're not lawyers, so we really appreciate the critiques that we hope you guys will offer on what we're doing, because that's how this is very interdisciplinary work. And in particular, we've done a lot of work both looking at corporate funding, corporate profits, R&D spending, and also the growth of companies, but also the front end, which is frequently ignored, namely the body of basic science, which is largely funded by the public sector, in this country by the NIH, which makes all of that possible. And Dr. Cleary has led that work, and I'm going to let her really describe the work that she's taken the lead on. And then I'm going to come back for really the last third of this and talk more about the operational structures by which the science moves into industry through BIDOL, through tech transfer, and how that is or is not, and I'll leave that as a question for you, really serving the needs of the public. So Dr. Cleary, it's all yours.
Great, thank you very much. Let me start that again because I have to share the computer sound. Here we go. So thank you for the introduction. A lot of this research has been really interesting to me because my background is not law either. It is bioinformatics, biology, and mostly studying the way cellular organisms work computationally prior to this, but I'm getting into a lot of health policy research, which is very exciting to me. So as promised, I am going to introduce our study looking into the role of NIH funding in drug development, and then we can discuss policy applications at the end. So our motivation for doing this work came from hearing about the proposed cuts to the NIH budget a few years ago, about 3 years ago. And we wanted to be able to show the importance of the NIH. So we embarked on this research. And even though we did not have the results in time for the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, which discussed the allocations, we did tune into a conversation between Senator Richard Durbin and Dr. Francis Collins, who discussed the NIH budget, which, by the way, has been decreasing as a % of GDP since 2003. So I'm going to play this clip for you, which forms the basis for our motivation.
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Collins. If I were to ask you whether or not NIH research was part of the development of a certain pharmaceutical drug or part of the development of a certain medical device, could you trace the lineage of the research so that you could tell me a yes or a no if NIH was involved?
I think usually we could, and in about 75% or so, the questions of that sort you would ask, the answer would be yes, NIH played a role, not necessarily a direct proximal role to the ultimate product.
Right, so what Dr. Collins is saying here is that in about 75% of the cases, you could make the connection between NIH funding and a drug. However, as we were doing this research, we were finding a bigger role for the NIH than was previously recognized. And I'm going to share that outcome with you. But before I do,
Let me ask.
I wanted to share with you the process of the drug development and the players that are involved. So the public and the private sector have very distinct but complementary roles in the drug development process. The public sector, the government, primarily funds the basic research, while the private sector funds the clinical trials. So the basic research, this gray part right here, does not have a particular application or product in mind. The purpose of this type of research is to gather knowledge about scientific processes. And this knowledge forms the backbone that then leads to drug candidates being tested in the clinic by pharma and biotech, by the private sector. And that part is called applied research. Now, basic research takes a long time, takes decades of years before someone finds it useful to drug development. And clinical trials also take a long time, and they're very costly. The amount of investment into clinical trials is a number that's very difficult to get, but not impossible. And a lot of researchers have published on clinical trial costs and research and development costs with the proprietary data that they were able to obtain. However, what wasn't known is the amount of investment into the basic science, which is the avenue that we took. So, the one other thing that I want to add is that when a drug is brought to market, it's certainly great news, and the pharmaceutical company is acknowledged, is celebrated, but the NIH does not get a shout out and does not get acknowledged in the same way. So it's important, it was important for us to bring recognition to the NIH, because certainly when the price is set, you know, people don't think about how important the role of the government is. And certainly when the price is set, it is not considered, which is a health policy change that, you know, we might want to talk about later. But just so you understand, the way we went about this research is by harnessing the knowledge that the way drugs work is by binding to a protein target inside the body, which in turn modifies the disease process. So for example, by stopping the spread of cancerous cells. So when we scoured the literature for mentions of drugs that were approved in the last decade, we not only searched for the name of the drug, but also references to its target protein. And in that way, we were able to quantify the basic research, which is on the target, versus the applied research, which is on the drug itself. So the first thing we did is to look through FDA reports in order to identify which drugs were approved since 2010 and find the associated molecular targets. We then moved into PubMed, which is a database of peer-reviewed publications, and we found that body of literature that mentioned either the drug or the target protein. Finally, in order to connect the research, we harnessed NIH Reporter and found which grants were associated with the publications and the amount of funding for these grants. As a result, we found that there were over 2 million unique research publications related to the 356 drugs that were approved in the last decade or their target proteins. And as you can see, the majority of this research is pertaining to the target protein or the orange bar. A smaller percentage of the research is pertaining to the drug. So the basic research leading to these discoveries starts back decades, goes back decades of years before the drug is discovered and then approved by the FDA. And when we look to see how many of these publications cited NIH funding, we found that about a quarter of them did. And then to put dollar figures on this investment, the NIH had invested about $180 billion in order to develop drugs in order to enable the research that led to these drug approvals. So to summarize, the most important insight out of our paper was that NIH funding led to every new drug that was approved since 2010. And so we had 356 drugs in this data set. They were written about in 2 million publications. The NIH had contributed over 400,000 fiscal years of NIH funding and $180 billion. And this constitutes about 30% of the NIH budget, which, you know, is very efficient. And what is beyond the scope of this talk are the valuable spillover effects. So a grant that contributed to one drug also contributed to drugs in other therapeutic areas, which you see most prominently with cancer research spilling into immunology research and metabolic diseases and CNS. And there are a lot of agencies that were involved. So the conclusion to our piece was that any reduction in NIH funding could significantly delay the emergence of new drugs. So the original study that was published in 2018 was recently updated over the summer, which are the statistics that you see now. But as this was happening, the pandemic hit. And so we wanted to also investigate the NIH contribution to the COVID-19 response. So the first clinical trial in the United States to evaluate an experimental treatment for COVID-19 happened on February 21, and the compound that was tested was Gilead's drug remdesivir. And this was a trial launched jointly with NIH and Gilead, and it happened just a couple months after the SARS-CoV-2 virus was discovered, and a little bit before the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus a pandemic. And then things moved pretty quickly. We saw the first positive trial results for remdesivir happen on May 1st, which is fairly unprecedented in terms of how quickly this turnaround was. And the results show that patients who received remdesivir had a 31% faster recovery time compared to those who received a placebo. And then shortly thereafter, the remdesivir price was set. And just a couple of weeks ago, the FDA officially approved remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19. Now, it's important to note that the speed with which the vaccine development has been happening and treatment development for COVID would not proceed as quickly had the foundation not been in place. So remdesivir was repurposed from Ebola and hepatitis C research. And there were a lot of on-the-shelf technology that were crucial for the rapid development of treatments and vaccines. So if we look at several outbreaks that helped the research get to the point of where it is now, we've had several Ebola outbreaks throughout the years. The most prominent ones were in 2014, and the one that's still ongoing today, that started in 2018, also had the MERS and the SARS virus outbreaks. And you'll see later how reactive funding is to these events. And so our research began before any of the events happening with remdesivir occurred. Because the NIH reported database is updated every year, we still don't have data for 2020, but we were able to capture all of the NIH funding up through 2019 that enabled the quick development of remdesivir and the vaccines. So our studies show that the NIH contributed over 6,000 project years and over $6 billion towards the discovery of remdesivir's biological target, RDRP. And RDRP is an enzyme that replicates the viral genome. Another portion of this funding went towards discovering the chemical structure of remdesivir, which is a class of nucleoside analogs. And mostly the funding that we saw here captures the basic science. Another team of researchers was estimating the public investment into remdesivir's preclinical and clinical research, and that stood at just over $70 million. So it doesn't seem like this is a large amount, $17 million, compared to what may be $1 billion that Gilead spent to bring the drug to market. But it shows that the role of the public sector is not as clear-cut anymore, and that there are certainly many instances where government funding is now going into clinical research, which is really important. So let's look at pricing for remdesivir, which did not take into account the government contribution. So remdesivir was one of the first drugs, if not the first drug at the time, that showed promise. And it was able to decrease hospital stay by an average of 4 days, which might not seem like a lot. However, hospital bills are very expensive. Therefore, the hospital savings was estimated to be $12,000, which, is really no small thing. If we look at the pricing of remdesivir, the price that was set for the government was about $2,300 per the treatment course. And remdesivir is a drug that is administered through the IV. So these are the more severe cases that are benefiting ones where the person is at the hospital. The private insurance price was a little more at $3,000 per course. And in other developed countries, they received a lower price of the two. So it might seem like this is really expensive. The cost-effective price that was established by the Institute for Cost Effectiveness Research falls in line with this number. But what is important to note is that they considered a mortality benefit. And now we're on the third trial of remdesivir, and we still are not seeing a conclusive mortality benefit or survival benefit with this drug. So technically, without this benefit, the cost-effective price would be just $310. So there were a lot of people who expressed concern over this pricing. There were 3 letters coming from US representatives, attorneys general, and state treasurers asking to reprice the drug, asking to acknowledge the taxpayer investment, and perhaps even exercise margin rights to help decrease the price. And we'll talk about margin and buy-dole later on in this talk. But the other piece that we did look at is NIH funding of vaccine development now. And what we did is we investigated 10 technologies that were incorporated in the candidate vaccines as of July 2020. And you can see what these are on the left. In total, the NIH invested 16,000 fiscal years of grant funding and $17 billion to bring the vaccine to a point, or bring the research to a point where it's ready for the testing. And you can see in the graph that a lot of this research is going up, that is trending upwards, except in 2014, you see a bit of a decline in support. And we're not sure why that is, other than, you know, vaccines are really cheap, but they generally cost as much time to develop as are treatments. And so there's not a lot of incentive for pharmaceutical companies to take this path. And the longest or the shortest time that a vaccine had been developed is the one for polio, and that took 4 years. So obviously we're seeing a record speed here because of the foundational funding that was already in place, the foundational research. But if we look at some of these trends, funding for pandemic threats is very inconsistent and very reactive. So if we focus on Ebola, which is the yellow line here, we have an outbreak and then funding goes up and then it decreases until there's another outbreak and then interest is renewed. And we saw that very prominently in the recent Zika pandemic, where it looked like people were scrambling to do the research to prevent babies from having microencephaly, and then this interest started going down and there's still no vaccine. So I want to highlight the importance of public-private partnerships, where we have something like the ACTIVE program for accelerating COVID-19 interventions and vaccines, where there are a lot of players working together. We have the NIH and other government agencies. We have top industry leaders, and we have nonprofits all working together to come up with treatment and vaccines so that we can help our economy recover. But then we have to ask the question of really who reaps the benefits. A lot of our research is interpreted in terms of the taxpayer paying twice, once for the research and another time again for when the medications are priced out of reach. And you know, it's important to recognize that the public and the private investment are both contributing to drug development. And I outlined that basic research where we have about $1 billion that goes into the development of a first drug in its class, is now starting to approach the investment of the private sector, which costs about $2 billion to bring a single drug to market. And the question here is the public acting as an early investor in the production of drugs, but not receiving any acknowledgement or any return on its investment? And this is an idea that was first presented during a congressional hearing by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I'll play a short clip for you, but basically it's the question that I was outlining.
So the public is acting as an early investor, putting tons of money in the development of drugs that then become privatized, and then they receive no return on the investment that they have made.
Right.
You're familiar with the study that shows that between 2010 and 2016, of every drug, all 210 drugs that were approved by the FDA were funded by the NIH or public money.
Would it be correct, Dr. Kesselheim, to characterize the NIH money that is being used in development and research as an early investment?
Yes.
So the public is acting as an early investor in the production of these drugs. Is the public receiving any sort of direct return on that investment from the highly profitable drugs that are developed from that research?
No, in most cases, there isn't. When those products are eventually handed off to a for-profit company, there aren't licensing deals that bring money back into the coffers of the NIH. That usually doesn't happen.
So I want to leave you with this thought before we move on to the second part of the talk, to think that maybe something should change where the government or the NIH should receive a return on its investment. And I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Ledley, who will introduce the second part of our talk.
And Fred, while you're going through, if you can just remind people that they're welcome to ask questions during your talk, and there'll certainly be time, we hope, to save at the end.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, yes, we can.
Is part of the slide blocked with your faces, or? Okay.
People can just minimize the faces if they want to see.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, because I still see that on my screen. Okay, so thank you, Kat. That was great. I was putting some things in the chat room when some questions came up, and I will continue to do that, not while I'm talking, but afterwards. So just let me reiterate some key points that I'll elaborate on. One is probably the biggest take-home message from our work to date has been that there is a sense, and I've historically said this too in talks, that basic science is cheap and development is expensive. And we are surprised ourselves at the scale of the NIH investment that's necessary to enable drug discovery and development. And there are other threads of our research if people have questions, which are much more geeky, where we really show the necessity of a mature body of basic science in order to successfully develop drugs. So we have a scale we developed and have shown that basically drugs almost never get developed successfully until that basic research is mature. So we are very concerned about the notion of moving too rapidly from scientific discoveries to applications. We think the model, and in fact, the numbers we see everywhere we look like those associated with monoclonal antibodies. For those who have followed this, the great Nobel Prize winning experiments were in the early 1970s, and the first successful product wasn't launched until the late 1990s. So we knew we've shown basic science is important, and we now have also shown it's way more expensive than we realized, with the burden being borne by the public sector. The private sector over the last years, and I'll show you a tad of data about this, has steadily withdrawn from very early stage research for various reasons. There is a process by which basic science is transferred to industry in order to be developed. And this, the ideas for this really go back, we do some of this in our working paper, go back to the late 1940s. But the whole idea of transferring science to the private sector for development was operationalized by the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. It existed before, but this has been the governing law for the last 40 years now. And this is the primary method by which, if an institution or an investigator or the government wish to have some control or some leverage on the process, on the product that's developed, really the only way to do that at the moment is through the Bayh-Dole process. Scientists usually, most academic research is simply published. It's put in the public domain. You may have to pay for the article, but the intellectual property in that article is now publicly available. And as we'll show, the vast majority of NIH funding is going into that open source, unprotected body of knowledge. And many people in science believe that's right. It's a great discussion going on at the moment. So what is Bayh-Dole? So this is a very cursory description of Bayh-Dole. That when a scientist makes an invention with federal funds, the law says that they must file a subject invention with their institution. And the definition of this incorporates the legal definition of the term invention with implications such as novelty and utility and enablement and all the things you guys either teach or are learning about in classes. The institution then conducts an internal review to assess the patentability of that information and its commercial potential. And they may choose to file for patent protection. So the default is that the institution, the grantee, assumes ownership of the advance and files patent on it. If the institution declines, the funding agency has the right to, can assume those rights, although that almost never happens. And what happens most commonly is those rights are returned to the inventor. The government retains conditional march-in rights, which are a matter of intense debate at the moment. If people care, we can do that at the end. The important part about Bayh-Dole is it authorized the institution to license those patents, either exclusively or non-exclusively, and to be paid in return. And there are a wide variety of ways that that contract can be structured. And importantly, the proceeds are retained by the nonprofit institutions for their public purpose. So the implicit principle of Bayh-Dole is that the public is served, and the public gets their return on investment from the proceeds that flow to a nonprofit institution. Bayh-Dole is a little bit less clear what happens in for-profit institutions, but the assumption is most government grants, and this is true, are going to nonprofits. Okay, so a lot of text on this slide, but this is the, it's important to realize the purpose of Bayh-Dole. So this is from the paragraph of the law titled Policy and Objectives. And I'll just point out some of the key points. The very first is the first phrase. The objective is to use the patent system, right? So this isn't really talking about broadly about government funding. It's only talking about that small subset of government-funded research that leads to a patent. And it's about promoting the utilization, the commercialization, collaboration, competition, is to promote business. And this is very purposeful. And it includes many ways for the public to win. For example, there is a preference to license to US-based corporations. And in particular, US-based corporations that create jobs in the United States. And that is the fundamental goal here. There's nothing here. This law doesn't just apply to health, by the way. It also applies to all government-funded research. And there is a clause at the end that the government obtains sufficient rights to meet the needs of the government. Obviously, in defense and emergencies, the government has broad rights, and protect the public against non-use or unreasonable use. And the term unreasonable use is also a matter of exquisite debate at the moment related to drugs and particularly drug pricing. So the battle's been going on for about 30 years of whether Bayh-Dole achieves its purpose. Just a few snapshots of this. In fact, not only have the number of patents skyrocketed in the past 40 years, but so has the fraction of those patents relying on federal funding, so that it's now up to about 30% of all patents approved by the USPTO have federal funding, which means there's a particular clause that has to be added to those patents as part of Bayh-Dole. And the number of invention disclosures has gone up roughly in proportion to the US research expenditures. There's no discontinuity. This only starts in 1991, so you don't actually see the effect in the 1980s. But this is considered marks of success, that as the government is funding more and more research, is leading to invention disclosures and more patents. And in fact, the ultimate champions of Bayh-Dole is a group called AUTUM, the Association of University Technology Managers. And this is their conclusion at the top here. Is Bayh-Dole achieving its purpose? AUTUM, which is all the tech transfer offices in the country, almost all, would say the answer is resoundingly yes. Trillions of dollars of increase in GDP and industrial output, millions of jobs, most of the advances in science. And I don't think many people would argue with these numbers. So that there is, at least in the tech transfer community and much of the science community, a lot of enthusiasm about what has happened in the last 40 years under this law. There are some warning signs, however. So we've graphed here the gross licensing income. This is how much income comes back to every member of AUTUM. So this is what's being paid back to basically all the universities in the country on an annual basis compared to non-defense R&D spending. And so the amount of direct return coming back is only about 3 or 4% of the total non-defense R&D spending every year. And non-defense spending represents only about 40% of all R&D spending. So those numbers may be proportionately even less. So that's kind of a clue. The issue of the direct returns has really become central to policy because of the work of Dr. Mariana Mazzucato in London. She is a bit of a celebrity economist and doing some just brilliant writing. She has a wonderful book called The Entrepreneurial State. And her fundamental argument is to see taxpayers as early investors in innovation. That's the phrase that Representative Ocasio-Cortez used. And in fact, Mariana Mazzucato has worked very closely with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and that's where the phrase comes from. Took us a while to track that one down. The concept that's being promulgated is that venture capitalists, as some of you know, like to describe themselves as risk capitalists because they invest very early in products. And because they invest very early, they expect a particularly high return. In contrast, investors who might invest late in development and where the product has been de-risked, which is a phrase you hear frequently in finance courses at our institution. When you have a de-risked product, one anticipates one's returns on investment will be somewhat lower. That's that's very much a first principle of corporate finance. Risk is going to be proportional to return. So to put it in this language, the question is the public actually getting that return? And Dr. Mazzucato argues that the indirect returns may not be sufficient to create this balance between risk and reward. So the public wins in many, many different ways, right? So forms of public return, I outlined them. They were listed in the preamble to the Bayh-Dole Act. Products for public benefit, for example, drugs, job creation, indirect payments like taxes, right? This is a very important part of the argument, is that by selling profitable products, the government takes a fraction of that back in taxes, the taxes on salaries, taxes on profits, direct payments in the form of license fees through Bayh-Dole, and ultimately economic growth. What concerns people are trends that reduce this return. So for example, if drugs are not affordable to certain people in the population, then those people do not get the health benefits of those drugs. So the question has been raised, and there is extensive evidence for this in the medical literature, that there is a point at which high prices are compromising the health of people, particularly in lower socioeconomic classes, and very appropriate to mention today, particularly with Obamacare being at some substantial risk. So that tends to compromise the return on government's investment. Job creation. There's tremendous concern about the offshoring of jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs, and jobs related to the products once they hit the market. Indirect payments such as taxes. This is one of the reasons that the very elaborate tax avoidance strategies of industry, one of many reasons it raises concern. So Pfizer, many of these companies are Irish companies, and it's not to do business there, it's to minimize the tax load in the United States, which paid for the basic research. So while they may pay a lot of taxes worldwide, these types of strategies minimize the return to the US taxpayer that paid for the basic science. The direct payments are only relevant to patented inventions, and I'll have a few words to say about that in a moment. And the economic growth and the importance of economic growth is very much tempered by growing socioeconomic inequalities in our country. So the stock market does not reflect people's sense of economic well-being or the returns to the taxpayer. So those are where the concerns are coming from. So let me just give you a snapshot of how little of this NIH funding is actually now covered by Dole and any opportunity for a direct return. So this is some preliminary data using the same data set that Dr. Cleary talked about, all the drugs approved in the last 10 years, 2010 to 19. And we asked how many of the patents in the Orange Book, which are the patents that are most important in protecting the drug, particularly against generic incursions. I shouldn't use the word incurred. I shouldn't describe them as incursions, particularly around Bruce Leicher. But how many of these patents, these most commercially important patents, were in fact funded by the government? And the Orange Book, as some of you may know, used to be a book. Now it's a website published by, importantly, not by the FDA, but by one division within the FDA, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And 313 of the drugs in our study was approved by that branch of the FDA. Of those, we know that 34 had at least one NIH-funded patent. How do we know this? Going through Dr. Cleary's logic, where we tracked all the publications about the drug or the drug target. We identified all the NIH-funded projects that contributed to those publications. And using the same database, we could now identify patents that originated with that NIH-funded research. So we know that 34 of our drugs had NIH funding. 29 of the drugs had funding in our study, because again, we only looked at research related to the drug or drug target. We didn't look at formulation or packaging or manufacture or many other things. So somewhere between 9 or 10% of all the drugs have some NIH funding. That number has been reported by many others. That's been well known for about 20 years. The work of Sampat and Stevens and others have shown about 10% of drugs have at least one NIH-funded patent. Our study showed that for the $180 billion of NIH funding, 90% of which was for basic research, there were 22,000 issued patents. That's a lot of patents, a lot of work for patent attorneys. Of those, we also know that the Orange Book had 3,644 patents related to our drugs. The intersection of those two sets, that is all the patents that came from the NIH funding we found, and all the patents in the Orange Book related to our drugs, was 104 patents. That's 0.05% of all the patents that were funded by the government in our data set. And it was 2.9% of all the patents related to these drugs in the Orange Book. Numbers are getting smaller. When we look at how much of the NIH funding was related to these patents, and we look at project years, how many fiscal years of funding contributed to a published work and one of these patents, we find that only 0.2% of all the fiscal years we identified were associated with a patent that went to Orange Book. And when we look at the dollars, and not to confuse you, we have changed our methodology in the past couple of months, but 0.5% of all the money that we identified in our study is accounted for by the patents that are in an Orange Book. Huge drop off.
Fred?
Yeah.
So that's a really important point, and maybe it's I know we're approaching sort of the end of the hour, so maybe there's I just want to suggest maybe we wrap up and go to questions, because that was really a key punchline there.
That's great. Let's do that. I will just leave this up to promote questions, and time to Bruce, turn it over to you here.
No, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think Fred made, and Kat, Dr. Ledley and Dr. Cleary, the key point that when I learned about this, when I heard about it, was just what he was getting to, which was only half a percent of the NIH funding goes into what ultimately NIH gets a return on, which are the subject inventions. So what we'd like to do is open this up for questions now, and I know Stan, I know you had a question or two you might want to ask first, so let me turn it over to you because the IP issues are really front and center here as well. And there may be some suggestions you have for the research as well.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, there's so many questions. I mean, I don't know where to start, but I'll start someplace. First of all, the clip, Kat, the clip, I think it was Kat or Fred, showed the clip of Congresswoman Cortez.
Yeah, I did.
And her commentary. And maybe I missed something, but I thought that with Bayh-Dole, the funding would go from NIH usually to a university, and then the university subsequently licenses, and then they get the return and not NIH per se. Did I understand or misunderstand or understand her misunderstanding correctly?
Right, like you said, it doesn't go to the NIH, which was her question. It goes to the university.
Right, Stan, so
It can be, Stan,
the assumption in
sorry,
Bayh-Dole.
sorry, Fred, go ahead.
So the assumption in Bayh-Dole is when money goes back to a university, it's going to the public sector. So it's not going to taxpayers. And that was, I think in her discussion with Aaron Kesselheim, the answer is not zero. That yes, the government is not in the business of collecting royalties on people, but the public sector is paid back, and that was the 2 to 3 billion number I showed you of how much is the public sector getting back each year from the Bayh-Dole licenses.
Yes, and the other aspect of that in general that I'm hearing, but I'll restate it, is that the intellectual property, not the intellectual property rights, the intellectual property assets, knowledge generated by the NIH is a broad-based public good, which is not necessarily quantifiable immediately. I read an interesting article in The Economist several weeks ago about the COVID vaccine, the race to get a COVID vaccine. And The Economist magazine sort of clumsily, if that's a word, analogized the 100 or so COVID vaccines under development to 100 pizzas. And then in the end, there's one pizza that I like, which is like this commodity, it's a commodity mindset, a commodity paradigm of intellectual property and intellectual assets, which is really incorrect. It's sort of this paradigm still dominates the discussion because an intellectual asset or knowledge which is developed 15, 20, 30 years ago may be relevant to a COVID vaccine, which is under development now. So I think that's also important to put into the discussion, and it's the combination of the different components which may produce a vaccine, some of which may be already in the public domain.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a great summary. And I think what we did in we could put up the link to our vaccine paper and our remdesivir paper, but the only way to develop a vaccine quickly was to take off the shelf technologies. You can't start to invent something in 9 months. So, we looked at those on the shelf technologies that were available and, how much government money went into those. It's less clear with the vaccine work that we can distinguish pure basic science, or as we define it, research on targets or mechanisms, as opposed to products. But still, it was about $17 billion of NIH funding over the last 20 years, identifiably related to the technologies that people are using now, including the RNA. RNA is probably the least mature of all the technologies. That's kind of what our paper looked at. But because the genetic methodologies are so popular, they've received enormous amounts of government money super added to whatever companies like Moderna and Pfizer and I can't remember the name of their biotech partner do. I did this in response to one of the chats before, that this is all predicated on a model that you need. The critical mass of basic science you need isn't just the invention. It's the person who publishes a paper confirming that great advance. It's the people who refute the bad ideas. It's the people who work out, angstrom scale crystal structures to refine the 10 angstrom scale structures. Yeah, every one of these, these are the pieces that are not patentable. There is potential, may or may not be utility in refuting something, right? By definition, there isn't. But one of the things that's limited industry in the past is inaccuracies in the basic science literature. Amgen has published this. So just as important as the great, patentable aha moments in science is the body of knowledge that tells industry what's useful, how to use it, and provides the mechanical details so that it's in fact useful.
I'll just comment on that, then I think there'll be other questions. I spent 20 years working in biochemistry labs. So I worked at the University of Rochester in the early DNA polymerase work, which led finally to, DNA diagnostics and tests and things like that. So just to sum up what you said, really, my boss back in those days in Rochester said the most powerful tool in a lab is what? The telephone. Because you call somebody up and you say, how do you do this? And it's not in a patent, it's not in a publication, it's a community, it's an innovation community, which makes all this happen. It's what we call open innovation community. And I really think that's part of the NIH mission, is to build and foster that type of community. And then at the end of the day, there's a patent with a patent specification, which probably tells you nothing. It's the open innovation community that makes this go forward.
So the open innovation really, there's this important trend towards, making things more open and more sharing. Taken to its extreme, makes Bayh-Dole useless as a mechanism for ensuring public return.
So I saw a hand go up from Monica Yang. I don't know, Monica, if you still have a question.
Thank you. Actually, I think Professor Kowalski answered it. I was really curious about the way government funded, often what is considered know-how, gets transferred by way of consulting agreements to industry, and therefore isn't, coming back as a return. And whether there would be any consideration, or if you have heard anything about Bayh-Dole expanding reporting without limiting what goes into the public domain.
What I can say to that is, having done multiple over the years, many licenses under Bayh-Dole, it's a great frustration from an industry perspective that when you license a patent, you can't license the know-how with it exclusively. In fact, the inventor, whether it's at NIH, sometimes NIH gets the royalties, sometimes an academic gets the royalties if the lab invents it, is free to publish and disclose and get on the phone, as Stan said, and talk to anyone they want about it. And that's the way the current system works. And as we hear from the research, that represents 99.5% of all the funded research. So it's just the way it is now. So there may be a call for some way of changing that, but I don't know if that's a good idea or a bad idea. Are there any other hands up? Lauren, yes, Lauren Myers.
Hi, I'm completely new to this subject, so forgive my ignorance, but the thought that this model seems to be very unsustainable, and the fact that the spending being dedicated and the percentage of GDP going down, and then, maybe I just don't have a whole lot of confidence in the consumer being protected, but it seems as though the benefits to the public are ever decreasing as time goes on. So is there any kind of movement to make NIH more sustainable, and understanding that maybe, I mean, I don't know that taxes are the option, but some kind of revenue being really an investment in keeping NIH going to, you know, keep this open flow of knowledge, but for the public's sake?
Yeah, Dr. Ledley, I think you may want to talk about the motivation for you doing this research.
So that's exactly the question that, well, actually, Dr. Cleary showed the video that we saw, which really made us realize this needed to be done, was that the support, public support for the NIH, which has always been very robust and one of the few bipartisan things, even in the past administration, or despite the proposals to cut NIH budget, it never really had any legs. And the NIH budget, in fact, increased over the past 4 years, while many other research budgets were gutted. As long as this is a matter of political whim, it's always going to be at risk. Now, industry is strongly supportive of NIH funding. This is where the bipartisan support comes from. They know that this is where their what powers their innovation. And we would love to see some kind of structure worked out where enough of the return to the public sector, in fact, went to making this sustainable. And we think that in the long run, that's very important. We see federal funding under tremendous pressure in coming years due to the real shrinkage of discretionary spending. Even before COVID, discretionary spending was being pressured both by defense and by debt and by health spending. So that it is really important to think forward for the next 40 years, if we want to continue to see this innovation, that there's a more robust mechanism to assure this support for basic science. There was a question that came up during the blog about the NIH keeps being pressured to go more into translational science and do more downstream work. We understand where that's coming from, but we're also concerned that that may compromise the budget for the basic science, which is less exciting. Research, I sometimes say, research on worms and snails and flies doesn't get the taxpayer excited, but that's the first step in bringing new drugs forward.
See if there are any more questions. You know, one comment I'll make, it's a comment I made to Dr. Ledley and Dr. Cleary when we were talking about this a few weeks ago, which is if you step back to the 30,000 foot level, what the government is doing here is really not any different than what the government did back in the 1800s when it gave land away to the railroads to build railroads. They kind of said, if you have the land, you can then go and invest and make all this money off of all this interstate commerce. And that's kind of what exists for the pharma industry today on top of this NIH funding. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm not making a value judgment about it. It is a model, and you have to decide, is that list of public returns that you're getting at Fred, you know, that you listed enough or not enough? And that's really the question. But it is not an atypical federal regulatory regime. We do the same thing with aircraft routes. Historically, we did the same thing with FCC bans. We do the same thing with giving people mining rights. The first person to find a gold lode gets the mining rights. But it's all a question of using exclusivity, like in the patent system, which is a lot more rigorous, to encourage people to invest.
Can I ask a question?
So,
do you think the
me-
COVID vaccine, the COVID vaccine situation and the COVID pandemic will influence any shifts in policy around this? I mean, I know there's been lots of talk about, do we put enough consistent resources in public health vaccine development, antibiotic development, et cetera? Do you think we're going to see a shift?
Hope we see a shift. There are a lot of people who are saying that we should have been ready for a pandemic. It was Dr. Fauci's worst nightmare. But we weren't ready to the extent that we needed to be. There was a lot of foundational research to kind of preempt it. But a lot of what we're seeing is reactive, and hopefully, you know, some things will change. Absolutely. I hope.
Yeah, what's interesting is Pfizer being in the lead at the moment is very interesting because they have not taken federal money for development, pretty much alone among the major companies. They have been very clear that they're not going to take government money to develop the product, and they're not going to agree not to price the product competitively after the pandemic. And they have agreed to give it a cost. Almost all the major companies have agreed to make the vaccine available at cost. We can send people that information if anyone wants. A couple of companies, mostly the biotechs, have refused to sign on to that. But that makes them more of a discussant in what the future should be, because those who did take government money, well, there's no statutory requirement to limit their prices. It was not part of the contracts. It was not negotiated by the administration. You are going to see differential pressure here. What Pfizer does have is a $2 billion order for vaccine. So it's not that government money is going to end up in Pfizer, but the development was not funded by Pfizer, by the government.
So Stan, I know given your experience, I can't tell you how much we appreciate this incredible discussion, and there may be a question or two more, but Bruce, I think we may need to finish up. These students need to get to their classes, and we only have till 12:15. Yep. And I think this conversation should continue, and it's what we talk about in bioinnovation. But if you want to wrap up and maybe have Stan say a thank you, and we'll go from there.
No, I just wanted to say thank you very much to our guests. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I also really, Lucy, appreciate everything you've done to make this happen, and Stan as well. So I'll turn it over to Stan for a wrap up.
I just want to say thank you to everybody, and the only way to end this discussion is to say that this discussion has to go on a lot longer. We're just at the beginning. To build a real innovative economy is going to require I think a whole new way of thinking, and in a way we have to advocate for that. I won't take it any further than that because I don't want to get too political, but I'll leave it at that. And I want to really thank Fred and Kat for enlightening us today. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, onward to further discussions, and many of them. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see everybody on. Our co-collaborators in crime here, Richard and Leslie, etc. Thank you for joining, and all the students and who are grappling with these topics. I see one of my students, Butch, on here, who's writing a paper on this right now. So really great to have everybody. And thank you so much for your wonderful work, Fred and Kat, and your really clear presentation. It was excellent. It's going to be recorded, and AJ will make sure it's distributed to everybody so we can send it out. And Bruce has agreed to allow this conversation to continue. So more on that with everybody. Much appreciated.
All right, take care.
I'll just put my email in the chat room here. If people have questions or want to follow up, happy to hear from you.
And AJ, you can save the chat, right? I'm hoping he can.
It's in our papers. You'll find it.
It's in the recording.
I saved it just in case.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Farewell.
Bye-bye.